Teenagers watch a lot of television, and for decades it has always been like that, which is why networks go all out to aim at that demographic. Of course, we're now in a streaming era where shows like Never Have I Ever or Outer Banks might be what people watch, but even some of the other shows on streamers, like All American or Riverdale, they were technically cable shows that got brought over to the streaming community. But if you go looking up the best teenage shows, like aimed for that demographic, from 2000 all the way into the 2020s, unless we're counting, Sex Education, which dropped in like 2019, which I'm not. Degrassi is number one. It came out in 2001, 2002. And once it hit the American market, because it was made in Canada, it took over. Think of Degrassi as a bomb that went off. It's not that they were the first to do certain things, but they were first to do it in a very specific way. And after that, nothing was ever the same again. And yes, that is a Drake reference, because I'm from the group that actually watched Aubrey Graham first rap on that show, long before the mixtapes or the albums, before he was an ambassador for the Raptors or anything like that. But depending on who you ask, as far as Degrassi the Next Generation is concerned, because that is the version of the show I'm talking about, its impact could be described as probably something that ruined the state of teenage television. Now, I know that's not something I can just say. I brought the receipts to prove it. Because if you know what was happening in television prior to Degrassi rolling out in America, like the decade prior, and then what happened while it was going on, like when it aired, and then just look at the immediate years thereafter, you will see a shift. Because Degrassi technically blurred the lines on what was a teenage show. It released on Noggin when Nickelodeon and Paramount were trying to create a separate network, and it was supposed to be released for preschoolers. But then they said, let's have a teenage segment, like Teenage Block, on that same channel. Degrassi joins that block. And I'm even a part of the generation where, yes, I remember watching a live premiere of a Degrassi episode on Nickelodeon. I think they only did it once. And the goal was to basically convince Nickelodeon kids to be onboarded to move over to Teen Nick to start watching Degrassi. And guess what? They got me. That's how I started watching the show. So here is a way too honest breakdown of what actually happened in teen television, specifically leading up to Degrassi, during, and after. Because like I said before, nothing was ever the same again, and we are still dealing with the aftermath every time you turn on Netflix. Full disclosure, I am a Christian man, so I am going to be looking at all of this from that framework. Heading into the early 90s, Saved by the Bell dropped, and that show was incredibly successful, ran for a whole bunch of seasons, even did spinoffs. And at the end of the day, it was still pretty tame by most teenage standards. They did have a clear demographic, that's more or less who they were going for, but you couldn't really call it family television. You have a world where we don't see a lot of adults. They even tried the first season and tried to make it about the adults. It didn't work. Then they basically rewrote the show, brought in A.C. Slater as a character, and Jesse, and so on and so forth, to, Kelly Kapowski even, to make it work. And it did. But that was just one thing on the grid, because we had teen shows. And if you pay attention, Beverly Hills 90210, that's the early 90s when that hits, and that show was very successful. Then you get Dawson's Creek, and even Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the back half of the 90s. All these shows were unapologetic when it comes to pushing really hard on serious issues around identity, who likes who or who doesn't like who, as far as, gender politics, all of that was there. It was there then. But these shows aired on Fox and WB. They weren't airing on Nickelodeon or a Nickelodeon subsidiary, and they weren't pretending to be family television. Because that was the next group that we saw in the 90s. Family television. You're watching a family TV show, including The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, even a Boy Meets World, Sister Sister, or shows that maybe weren't as successful like A Smart Guy, maybe perhaps more successful like a Moesha. All of them fall in that category because you see adults on screen, specifically parents, actually parenting. Now, Fresh Prince kind of sets itself apart, very successful. I think it hit the teenage demographic a lot harder. Some of these other shows, except for maybe Moesha, which is kind of in a similar category with The Fresh Prince, they were kind of hitting the kids more than anything else and catching teenagers as well in the net. But family TV was also based around the idea that families might watch TV together. That is important, because aside from these first two bags, you had a third one. These were the shows like Clarissa Explains It All, or The Secret World of Alex Mack, still more or less the early 90s. And those were dropped by Nickelodeon. Disney wasn't even a problem to be worried about yet, because they didn't have a basic cable or standard cable channel yet till we hit the year 2000. almost before Degrassi drops. And those shows, yeah, they might have dealt with something halfway to serious, but they're aimed at the kids. You kind of have to package it in a way that will be acceptable in theory for the kids. Like, you can't say anything too clearly if you're trying to push on anything that's actually relevant to teenagers. But yes, it's still going to catch them in the net. But if you're new here, I want to say thank you for even making it this far into the video. I'm Ezra Garnett, and if you really want to know about the hidden messages in media from a Christian man who's actually trying to pay attention, then you are in the right place. And if anything that I say at all actually connects with you, it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe. But if I don't, just let me know in the comment section, because I try to read them all. Which basically brings us to Degrassi itself and everything that was happening around it. Because Degrassi, as a Canadian show, airs in America as far as I know in 2002. And when it does, shortly thereafter, the seasons keep rolling, like Degrassi the Next Generation. It's a show that, like I said, was onboarding kids from Nickelodeon and trying to move them into watching teenage programming. Degrassi kind of being, I guess the cornerstone, the most popular thing. I mean, I think everybody agrees, including IMDb, that Teen Nick was doing, the end, whatever we want to call them. I mean, the show went there, and it went there again. All of the, taboo topics. They talked about it. They went there. They put a character in their show who was involved with it. They were, even shooting characters like Wheelchair Jimmy. That's how that becomes a thing. As well as you have people who are, a character who passes away, some type of, violence, and the character is killed off. I believe that was JT. I mean, I watched the show well enough where I remember a lot of the plot unveiling and unfolding, as well as things around identity, and again, who likes who and who doesn't like who, and, whether it's a boy who's interested in somebody else who doesn't happen to be a girl. All of that was there, and it's pushing the needle pretty hard because that's now starting these conversations with teenagers. At the time, the network, Nickelodeon, or I guess Teen Nick, the End, whoever you want to call them, they wanted a show that they thought was educational for teens. And I guess throwing all of this on camera was considered educational to some degree. But the show actually looked a whole lot more like what you might have seen on Dawson's Creek, or something you might recognize from Beverly Hills 90210. It just was on a network that wasn't what we normally identified with that package. And that's why when the bomb went off, they touched a whole new group who stumbled into a type of program that maybe they weren't originally coming for. But once they tasted it, that was it. Degrassi was the talk of the town. And at that exact moment in history, these are some of the other shows that were still on the air. Gilmore Girls, 8 Simple Rules, Everwood, Malcolm in the Middle, Grounded for Life. All of these are shows where parents are represented. Now, they may not be traditional family shows. You could argue that that's not exactly how they made them. They have more dramatic elements and some of them comedic elements, but they were still hitting the teenage demographic pretty hard. And they're not on a network at the time like a Nickelodeon or something that's affiliated with them. All of these shows were a progression on family television. They didn't necessarily address every issue anymore from what I would like to call a moral high ground. That is very important. I mean, they still had adults represented, they were present in the plot, and they might even be some positive, scenes here and there. But overall, that wasn't their goal. They were trying to hit the entertainment button, and even if that meant you had to sacrifice a little bit of, integrity along the way to get there. And several years down the line, a show like Everybody Hates Chris still presses that exact same button. I call it hitting the entertainment button in the package of family TV, but that means that you can kind of sell integrity down the river because we don't need to focus on that so much. But there's still other shows because WB and Fox kept going. In 2003, we got One Tree Hill, as well as The OC. Both shows stayed on the air for a while. Again, some of that Degrassi energy is there, but they're on networks, WB and Fox. They're really just a progression on what we were doing in the 90s anyway, with Dawson's Creek and shows like that. And solidly after Degrassi had established itself, you still had shows that kept that same energy. Again, on these WB, now later on CW, NBC, all those networks. Veronica Mars, Friday Night Lights, Gossip Girl, 90210, the reboot, all of that happens in the back part of the 2000s, like 2004 on down. Which brings me now to the elephant in the room, because like I said before, Degrassi was released on Teen Nick, which at the time was a segment of Noggin, which is a Nickelodeon subsidiary. That means Nickelodeon and now Disney Channel, which arrived to the party, have to make a decision on what are they going to do about it. Because now that we're defining what we call teenage programming, and you're doing it with, again, that whole onboarding ramp for the kids. Well, if that's teenage programming, then what is kids programming? How do we draw that line? Because Degrassi was pretty clear. That thing wasn't really for the kids. But depending on who you ask, they still called it TVPG, which is very interesting. At the exact moment in history when Degrassi was rolling out, Even Stevens was on the air, and Lizzie McGuire were on the air. Early 2000s shows. Those shows are going to catch some teenagers in the net, but they are in no way, shape, or form trying to be anywhere near as serious about the very challenging issues with what they build into the plot. And they actually kind of do fit in. If you think about a Sister Sister or a Boy Meets World that rolled its way over to a Disney Channel, like they kind of fit right in. And Nickelodeon had their thing as well. You had shows like Taina, which did 2 seasons, and a few others. Like all of this is happening in what I call the Degrassi adjacent or pre-Degrassi era, technically on the network. So Taina is a high school related show. Like the main character, she's in high school. It's just not anything close to what Degrassi is. And then we see the aftermath, or for that matter, I call the recoil, because things changed. Because if we were going to touch on subjects prior, like A Smart Guy, where yes, they did have episodes in that show, like prior to when it's airing back on Disney Channel, like reruns later on, they'll talk about things like sexual relationships, like that's there. Or perhaps even, smoking, or like these topics come up. Even, something like almost like a To Catch a Predator episode. Like these things were actually there. But when I say there's a recoil, after Degrassi hits, Disney and Nickelodeon both don't touch those types of topics anymore. Not even a little bit, as far as I can tell. If you don't believe me, just consider. That's a Raven in 2003. Unfabulous, Drake and Josh, Ned Declassified in 2004. Zoey 101 in 2005. Hannah Montana, 2006. Wizards of Waverly Place, 2007. Just Jordan, True Jackson VP, 2007, 2008. None of these shows have any of the same energy of what we saw coming out of that family television window. Like, there was a schism. Kids TV had to take a step back because you used to catch teenagers in the net. Degrassi basically drew the line. This is what we send to the teens. Anything that is, I guess, on the lighter side of serious, or perhaps deals with the moral high ground, we're not doing that anymore. Morality is now going to be much more murky with what we're sending to the teenagers. And I would argue that energy is what we saw going forward. Of course, streaming happened and messed up the whole game, but just consider the back part of the 2000s. Gossip Girl, which is wildly successful, still more or less comes out in like the 06-07 window. They push the envelope. They go there, as far as I'm concerned, because of when exactly Degrassi was released and what network it hit. They had no choice but to draw a very strong line about what exactly was teenage television. And because they rose all the way to the top, you ain't got to take my word for it. Remember, IMDb says it for me. They set the standard of what teenage programming would be. Everything else had to be very clear, because you could put high schoolers on camera, like a That's So Raven. But if you were going to put high schoolers on camera and it wasn't going to look anything close to Degrassi, then you have to package it and send it to a much younger demographic. You might catch a teenager in the margins, maybe, but nothing like A Boy Meets World, which still rode in the middle and could catch people on both sides. Even that show still deals with more serious issues. It just does it from a moral high ground because it's catching people from both sides. Whether it's, should you, get together and have, an intimate relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend, what time is the right time to do that, serious issues like abuse, domestic violence, all of that. These things are not ignored in the plot structures by the writers. But by the time you get to 2019, with a show like Sex Education, and that being sold to the teenagers, again, streaming changed the rules, I get it. But you see what I'm saying? Now, because the line's been drawn, we can sell much harder now on that side. But you also have a reduction on the other. And Nickelodeon, or for that matter Paramount, and their bright idea to bring Degrassi to the States is what we have to thank for all of this. Because teenage television never was the same after it. Of course, the Degrassi brand itself fell off. Once the core group of actors that they launched with in 2002, again, for the American network, like when they all left, the show kept going. But I think that's just what it was. They kept going. And I know they tried to reboot it and send something to streaming. That happened. I don't really know how many people really watched it, but it occurred. I think the show itself continued to kind of redefine what it was and what it wasn't. When it first came out, I think it was still a serious drama with some comedic elements, with all of these, heavy, issues that were being negotiated. It was just a very unique package because, again, they thought of what they were doing as educational for teens. But incidentally, they redefined an entire genre that when you go on your streaming platform today and look at teenage programming, it is almost always now going to resemble Degrassi in some way. If you actually made it all the way to the end of this video, I do have to admit that thank you doesn't do it justice anymore because you are a real one. And if you want more from me beyond this, just realize there ain't no shame in my game. This is a new channel, so it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe.